It started with a group chat silence that felt louder than a slammed door. The same family thread that used to ping with recipes and photos in early November was dead quiet. No what should we bring? No who's hosting? Nothing. At first, I thought maybe they were just late this year, but when I sent a message, "Hey, are we doing Thanksgiving at Aunt Carla's again?" there was no reply, not for hours, then days. And when someone finally responded, it was my cousin Jess, saying, "Oh, I think Mom said it's going to be small this year, just immediate family." Immediate family. As if I hadn't been part of every holiday since I was a toddler. As if I hadn't peeled potatoes, set tables, stayed late to help clean while others slipped away with leftover pie. As if I wasn't blood. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to figure out what hurt more, the exclusion or the fact that no one had the courage to just tell me outright. On Thanksgiving morning, my kitchen was quiet, too quiet. I made coffee. I checked my phone. Still nothing. I sat on the couch in my pajamas, scrolling out of habit until I landed on Jess's Instagram story. That's when the pit in my stomach dropped. There they were, every single one of them. My parents, my siblings, Aunt Carla, all gathered around a table overflowing with food, laughing, holding wine glasses, posing like a magazine ad for family togetherness. The caption read, "So grateful for our little tribe." Little tribe. That was the dagger. I stared at that photo for a long time, heart pounding, face hot, fingers trembling. I wasn't angry yet, not fully. I was humiliated, rejected, erased. But shame is a short-lived emotion. It melts into something sharper. By nightfall, I wasn't crying. I was planning. Because if they wanted a picture-perfect holiday, they could have it. But not without the truth. Not without the backstory. Not without the part where they had quietly decided I wasn't worth a chair at the table. So I opened my laptop, pulled up a blank post, and began to write. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. But I told the story of what it's like to be the loyal one, the helper, the invisible fixture of family who only gets noticed when they stop showing up. I wrote about the year I nursed Dad through pneumonia while my siblings were on vacation, the birthday I spent alone because everyone forgot. I wrote about the countless holidays I cooked for, cleaned up after, smiled through, even when I was falling apart inside. And I ended with a photo, not of me crying, not of me bitter, but of my own small dinner. One plate, one glass, one candle, and a caption, "This year I'm thankful for finally seeing things clearly." By Friday morning, the post had taken on a life of its own. I hadn't expected much. Maybe a few sympathetic comments, maybe some quiet likes from acquaintances who'd been through something similar. But instead, it exploded. Hundreds of shares. Thousands of reactions. My inbox filled with messages that began with, "Same," and ended with, "Thank you." People told me about being the family's unpaid therapist, the one who remembered birthdays but was forgotten in return, the one who always showed up only to be met with silence. I read each message slowly, like a prayer. Not because I needed validation, but because for the first time, I didn't feel alone. Meanwhile, my family stayed silent. No one texted. No one called. But I knew they saw it. Jess stopped viewing my stories. My mother's profile, once filled with emojis under every photo I posted, was quiet. But the part that surprised me? I didn't care. Their silence no longer held power. It felt small. Like the tantrum of someone who knows they've been seen in the wrong light, or maybe for the first time in the right one. That weekend, I went to the park alone, a thermos of cider in my hand and a notebook in my bag. I sat under a fading tree and wrote a list titled "What I Know Now." The first entry, "My worth isn't measured by who invites me to dinner." The second, "Loyalty given without reciprocity is not noble, it's self-abandonment." The list grew longer, not bitter but clear, focused, freeing. I didn't write it for them, I wrote it for me. On Sunday night, I got a message from someone unexpected, an old teacher I hadn't spoken to in years. She said, "I read your post. I remember how often you stayed after class to help. I'm sorry no one saw you back then, but I see you now." I cried, not because I was sad, but because it had taken me so long to believe I deserved to be seen. And still, the silence from my family stretched. It was like they'd closed ranks around their shame, hoping if they ignored me long enough, I'd disappear again. But I had no intention of disappearing. In fact, I'd never felt more visible. That night, I posted a follow-up. I wrote about the messages I'd received, about how many people were quietly grieving the loss of the families they thought they had. I reminded everyone reading that being excluded from dysfunction isn't a punishment. It's a permission slip, a chance to build something different, healthier, real. And this time, I ended with a toast. To all the ones who set their own tables, who lit candles for themselves, who chose truth over tradition. It wasn't vengeance. It was clarity, served warm. And I didn't need anyone else to raise a glass for it to matter. By the time Monday came around, I had already been contacted by 2 online magazines and a mental health advocacy blog asking if they could republish my post. One editor said, "It's not just a Thanksgiving story, it's a survival story." I said yes, not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted the message to echo. I wanted someone, somewhere, scrolling through their own lonely weekend, to stumble across it and feel less crazy, less ashamed, more seen. I also knew that the next move wouldn't come from my family, it would come from the internet. And it did. By midweek, someone had sent me a screenshot of a private Facebook thread where my cousin Jess had posted a vague status. Family should be sacred, not content. Dozens of her friends chimed in, echoing the sentiment, clueless to the context. But I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because anyone who thought I had shared for clout clearly hadn't read the story, or they had, and it hit too close. That night, I got another message, this time from a woman named Valerie, who told me she'd been disinvited from her family's Hanukkah dinner after coming out to her parents. She said, "Your post reminded me that exclusion isn't always personal. Sometimes it's structural. Sometimes people can't handle what doesn't mirror them." I sat with that one for a long time, printed it out, pinned it next to the first message, proof that truth-telling doesn't isolate, it builds bridges between survivors. Later that week, I finally received a text from my brother. It was short. "You didn't have to go public." I stared at it, a knot in my stomach, because I knew exactly what that meant. He wasn't sorry for what happened. He was sorry people saw it. I didn't reply. Instead, I closed my phone and went back to editing the essay version of my post, which a freelance editor had offered to help me develop for a paid platform. As I worked, I noticed something I hadn't before. My hands didn't shake anymore. My breathing was even. My spine straight. For years, family drama had lived in my body like a virus, but now it was being exhaled, turned into something living, useful, clean. On Saturday, I went out and bought myself a new set of dishes. White porcelain, gold-rimmed. Not because I had guests coming, but because I was done eating off the scratched, mismatched plates from my childhood apartment. I set one place, lit one candle, made roasted carrots and chicken and poured a glass of wine. And I toasted to resilience, to boundaries, to telling the truth when it's easier to stay quiet. And then I took a picture. One plate, one glass, no caption, just peace. By the following week, the ripple had become a current. A podcast invited me on to talk about the post, and they titled the episode, "The Table You Build Yourself." It wasn't just a clever name, it became a lightning rod. Within hours of going live, thousands of comments flooded in. Some were heartbroken, some were livid, most were grateful. The hosts emailed me later and said, "We've never had this kind of response, ever." One listener wrote, "Your voice walked me back into my own kitchen, the one I always sat but never sat at." Another said, "I finally understand why I always felt so hollow after holidays. It wasn't the food, it was the erasure." That word hit me like a bell. Erasure. It echoed in my chest for days. Because that's exactly what it was. Not just forgetfulness, not just poor planning, but the deliberate, quiet act of pretending I didn't exist and writing me out of the family equation so seamlessly that they thought I wouldn't even notice. And for what? To keep things easy? To avoid discomfort? To preserve an illusion? Families like mine don't always have villains. They have scapegoats, and I had been theirs for years. The one who absorbed the tension, the one who smoothed things over, the one who stayed late to clean while everyone else laughed on the porch, and the one they quietly decided was no longer necessary when the optics got in the way. Then came the call. It was a Sunday afternoon. I saw Aunt Carla's name flash on my screen, the first voice from the tribe to break the silence. I almost let it ring out, but I didn't. I answered. She started with that soft, familiar tone, the one she used when she wanted something but didn't want to ask outright. "I heard you've been busy," she said, like we were just catching up after a long vacation. I didn't say anything. She kept going. "Look, I just wanted to say, Thanksgiving was never meant to exclude you." I let that sentence hang in the air. It felt flimsy, like a napkin trying to soak up a flood. "Then why didn't anyone say anything?" I asked. She hesitated. "Why did you all post it, like I didn't exist?" More silence. Then a weak attempt. "It wasn't personal." And that was the moment I knew she didn't get it. None of them did, because it was personal. It was personal the moment they chose not to respond to my message. It was personal the second they set the table and chose to pretend there wasn't an empty chair that should have been filled. I didn't scream. I didn't sob. I said, calmly, "I won't let you minimize what happened. I deserved better." Her reply, a sigh. Then, "Well, I hope this doesn't ruin Christmas." I nearly laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so telling. They weren't worried about the damage they did, just the appearance of a crack in their pretty little image. I ended the call politely, and then I made a decision. I wouldn't show up for guilt invitations anymore. I wouldn't accept crumbs just to be near a table that didn't have space for the full version of me. That same week, I opened my email and started writing. I wrote to my coworker who always brought me soup when I had a cold. I wrote to my neighbor who once carried my groceries up 3 flights of stairs. I wrote to my college friend who called every time her gut said I needed to hear a kind voice. I invited them all to something I called a gratitude dinner. I told them it wouldn't be fancy, just food, candles, music, a space to feel full, not just in our bellies, but in our bones. The RSVP responses came fast. "I'll bring pie. Count me in. Finally, a table I want to be at." And when that night came, 3 weeks after the one that gutted me, I stood in my tiny kitchen, apron dusted with flour, heart pounding in my chest. Not from sadness this time, but from joy. Nervous, glowing joy. I opened the door. They came in, laughing, hugging, carrying mismatched dishes and stories from the week. And as we sat, on chairs borrowed from neighbors, at a table pieced together from desks and folding leaves, I realized I had never felt more whole, because this time no one was calculating my worth before handing me a plate. No one needed me to shrink to keep the peace. And that changed everything. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a declaration. I'm here. I matter. And I'm done waiting to be chosen. I'll choose myself. Every time. The night of the gratitude dinner arrived with the kind of quiet that feels sacred. Not empty, but full of possibility. I lit candles along the windowsill, set out mismatched plates, and played Nina Simone softly through a secondhand speaker. Guests began arriving just after 6. My neighbor from 2 doors down with a tray of sweet potato casserole, my coworker Lila with her homemade cranberry chutney, even my mailman, who'd once stopped to help me carry groceries, showed up with a bottle of sparkling cider and a shy smile. No one asked for a seating chart. No one judged the cracked tile in my kitchen. We just were together, present. I looked around the table as dinner began, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged in a room I had built myself. There was laughter, easy, generous laughter, no passive-aggressive digs, no side eyes, no walking on eggshells, just warmth, curiosity, realness. I gave a short toast, something I hadn't planned but felt suddenly necessary. "Thank you for being here," I said, voice steady. "You showed up because you wanted to, not because anyone told you to. That means more than you know." They raised their glasses. We ate. We shared stories, not about achievements or holiday trips, but about hard years and small victories. Someone cried. No one looked away, and somewhere between the cornbread and the apple pie, I realized something. This wasn't just a holiday meal. It was proof. That connection doesn't have to come with conditions. That family isn't always inherited, it's chosen. And sometimes it chooses you back in ways you never expected. After everyone left, I stood at the sink, sleeves rolled up, hands in warm water, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. There were no photos staged for Instagram, no captions about being blessed. Just dishes, and silence, and the sound of a life quietly reshaping itself. Later that night, I posted a single image. A candlelit table, crumbs still scattered, plates half stacked. And the caption, "Turns out, the table I built fed more than my hunger." The post went modestly viral, not viral like my first one, not fiery with outrage, but slow burning, like a song people kept playing on repeat. One woman messaged, "I hosted my own dinner tonight because of you." Another wrote, "I used to beg for scraps of love, now I'm serving full plates." And I knew in that moment that I hadn't just reclaimed Thanksgiving, I had reclaimed narrative, community, purpose, not because I'd been handed it, but because I'd made it. With truth, with courage, with the stubborn refusal to be invisible ever again. The following week, something unexpected happened. A local radio host reached out after reading my post and invited me to speak on air about the Thanksgiving we don't talk about. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to make my pain that public, but then I remembered how many people had already told me it helped them feel seen, so I said yes. On the day of the interview, I sat in a small studio with foam walls and a cheap headset, heart pounding as the red on-air light flicked on. The host asked gentle questions. She didn't prod or sensationalize, she just let me tell the truth. About what it feels like to be cast out of a room you helped keep warm for years. About how exclusion isn't always loud, sometimes it's just silence. Empty chairs, group photos you're not in. And about how healing doesn't come from being invited back, but from realizing you never needed their table to begin with. When the interview ended, my phone lit up with messages from strangers, from old friends, even from two of my cousins who said they hadn't known I was excluded and were sorry they didn't speak up. One of them even asked to meet for coffee. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a crack in the wall. And sometimes, cracks let the light in. Meanwhile, my parents still hadn't said a word. Still no calls, no emails. But that too had stopped stinging. Because I'd stopped waiting. I didn't need their validation to feel worthy. I had proof of my value in every message that said, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't." I kept writing. I launched a weekly email letter called The Quiet Plate, filled with stories, reflections, and little truths about building a life after erasure. Thousands subscribed in the first month. Not for the drama, but for the honesty. For the reminder that their pain wasn't isolated, that being left out didn't mean they were nothing. It meant someone else made a choice they could no longer control. And in that realization, there was power. Quiet, steady power. I walked through my neighborhood differently now. Straighter, softer, stronger. I waved at neighbors I used to avoid. I smiled more. Because when you've lost the thing you thought defined your belonging and find out you're still standing, still breathing, that's when you realize you were never the problem. You were the foundation, and maybe, just maybe, you were meant to build something better. That December, a publisher reached out to me after stumbling across The Quiet Plate. She said my voice felt like a candle in a blackout, steady, unfussy, and needed. She asked if I'd ever considered turning the project into a book. I hadn't, but the moment she asked, something clicked. I said yes, before I could second-guess myself. Over the holidays, while everyone else posted photos of matching pajamas and twinkling trees, I was drafting chapters at my kitchen table, wrapped in an old sweater, sipping reheated coffee. I wrote about growing up in a family that loved tradition more than truth, about the invisible labor of being the dependable one, about how some silences are crafted, not accidental, strategies disguised as forgetfulness. I didn't write with rage, I wrote with clarity. And in the pages, I found pieces of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. A few weeks later, my mother finally called. No hello, no apology, just a stiff, "You've made quite a mess." I let her speak. I listened, not because I needed her approval, but because I wanted to hear what deflection sounded like when it was cracking. When she paused, I simply said, "I told the truth." She scoffed and muttered something about families keeping things private. I replied, maybe if we'd told the truth earlier, there wouldn't be so much to hide. And then, gently, I hung up. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I didn't ask for a seat at their table. I had already built my own. My father didn't call, but he read the blog. I could tell from the sudden surge of anonymous visits from their town's IP address. And I knew he saw the story. Not the one they'd scripted for years, but the one I had wrestled into existence, the real one. The book went into production in January. It was titled No Invitation Needed. A cover with one empty chair and one set for one. Pre-orders sold out within a week. Book clubs asked for discussion guides. Schools asked for permission to use essays in curriculum. What they tried to erase had become required reading. And I didn't need to say a word. Because legacy doesn't always come from the people who raise you. Sometimes it comes from the truth you refuse to bury. Sometimes it comes from the silence you break, not with volume, but with vision. The first time someone recognized me in public, I was standing in line at the grocery store holding a carton of eggs and a bundle of rosemary. A woman about my age turned, blinked, and said, "You're her, aren't you? The one who wrote No Invitation Needed." I nodded. She didn't say much else, just squeezed my arm and whispered, "Thank you." And somehow that quiet gesture meant more than any headline, any viral comment thread, any trending hashtag. Because this story, my story, was no longer just mine. It belonged to anyone who had been left out, overlooked, expected to stay silent while others passed the gravy and the credit. In the months that followed, I started receiving handwritten letters, long, aching, beautiful letters from women who had spent their holidays pretending they weren't heartbroken, from men who'd been called too sensitive, too dramatic, too much for simply wanting to be seen, and from teenagers who had decided that if they ever built families of their own, those families would look nothing like the ones they'd come from. Each message became a thread in the tapestry of something bigger than revenge, something gentler, more radical. It was restoration. It was the reclaiming of joy without permission. One letter ended with the words, "Because of you, I didn't spend Thanksgiving alone this year. I invited myself." I read that one twice, 3 times. Then I framed it, hung it above my desk. Because that was it. That was the point. The book tour began quietly. Local libraries, indie bookstores, community centers. No big publisher-funded glamour, just folding chairs, warm lights, and people who came not to gossip, but to heal. In one small town, a teenage girl stood up during Q&A and said, "I used to think family was something you just had to survive, but now I think maybe it's something you get to define." I wept that night, not out of sadness, but out of sheer, unfiltered awe, because once upon a time I'd cried alone at a table set for one. And now, rooms were being filled because of that solitude. My family never did apologize, but I no longer need them to. Their absence is no longer a wound. It's a clearing, a wide open space where I've planted something of my own, something rooted in truth, watered by grief, but blooming, unapologetically, in light. This Thanksgiving, I set the table again, only this time, it was full. Not with the people who share my last name, but with the people who see me, who hear me, who showed up. And maybe that's the lesson I needed all along, that the truth doesn't just break things, it builds. And that sometimes the family we lose is just the soil for the one we grow. If this story felt like your story, if you've ever held your silence like a sacrifice, know this: you were never too much. You were simply waiting for the table that was worthy of your voice. Share your story in the comments. Subscribe if this gave you breath. And remember, you don't need an invitation to belong, just your truth and the courage to set your own place.